Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining us for this session. Please be very welcome to the 5th UNESCO Forum on Transformative Education for Sustainable Development, Global Citizenship, Health, and Well-being. In this breakout session, we will focus on the role of teachers in transformative education, and particularly in the support that they can and do provide to schools and to communities. My name is Carlos Vargas, and I have the pleasure of leading the section for teacher development at UNESCO and the Secretariat of the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030. And I'm joined today by two panelists. We will be speaking to this, and we will be having a discussion on the issue of teacher participation and community participation in education, whom I will introduce now. With us is Dr. James Williams. He is an associate professor of the School for Education and Human Development at the George Washington University and a former director of the International Education Program. He is also the chairholder of the UNESCO Chair in International Education and also a member of the NISAM. We have another participant who will unfortunately not be able to join us from El Salvador, but our second panelist is Mr. Kichi Oyasu. He is the Director of Education Cooperation Department of the Asia Pacific Cultural Center for UNESCO. So just welcome James and welcome Kichi as well. So just as means of introduction, to say that as you have probably all realized through the pandemic, but before the pandemic already, the role of teachers in the quality of education is paramount. That's something we all know. And also the role that they play in making education equitable, inclusive, and adaptive to the many changing realities that we have seen. The pandemic is one of them, but we've seen also the reaction to different crises and the adaptation of the curriculum, of the pedagogies, of the forms of assessment that they have been able to do to sustain education in times of crisis. But this is also something that happens on an everyday basis as they engage with communities. We've seen, for example, in the policy responses to the COVID-19, how teacher participation in the ideation of the solutions and the innovation that they had in the classroom and in virtual environments, in rural communities to sustain learning is something that we basically relied on for teachers. So it was the role of teachers was paramount. We knew before. We have a renovated confirmation of the importance of teacher participation for programs to be effective, for the curriculum to be relevant, and this requires a lot of engagement. So on the one hand, there's work that UNESCO and the TTF have been doing to promote the role of teachers. There's a recent publication that you might be aware of that we launched at UNESCO just 2 weeks ago around the futures of education towards a new social pact, a social contract for education in which teachers are centerfold. The role of teachers as community builders, so it's not only as implementers of curriculum, but as community builders, also as policy partners, as they are closer to local realities, as they know better what the needs of the communities of the individuals are beyond the mandated curriculum and into the needs, as we said, that are societal. Therefore, the role also of their participation in social dialogue in allowing them the power to make decisions. So one of the issues around agency and autonomy of teachers, trusting the professional judgment as we plan ahead in education is some of the things that we will be speaking about in this panel. So just to begin, let me begin with Dr. Williams to start our discussions. James, in a recent article, you offered a few definitions of community participation in education. We're very happy to read that article and to use that taxonomy. What I would like you to ask you if you could please briefly define this taxonomy, what participation in education means, and to explain a little bit the importance of the participation of communities in education as an essential factor for education transformation. So, James, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you to the panel and the organizers for allowing us this opportunity. And thank you to the chair for the kind introduction. So community participation is an often used word in education. And it's important, I think, to think about what that means. First of all, to state that the, starting my clock here so I don't get carried away. First of all, I think it's important to assert that a positive, strong relationship between community and school and teachers and students is critical to good education taking place. And so getting that relationship right is very important in supporting teachers, in supporting students, and supporting the education. This has become very clear in the pandemic, in which the role of parents, the role of community has become very clear. Reasons for a positive relationship with the community, different types. There are community participation, like other forms of participation, can be very extensive or very limited. And it's important, I think, to think about the different levels of participation. One form of participation is a very simple one, sending children to school. That's pretty minimal. A much more extensive form of participation at the other end might be where communities set up, manage schools. That is probably farther than most systems go. Most school systems have found that a national system is the way to best support to provide education for all children. And so somewhere in the middle between a very minimal participation and a maximum communities running schools is the ideal for different, and that will vary by different situations. Parents can be involved in instruction. They can be involved in assisting instruction. Parents increasingly are understood to have a co-instructional role with teachers. And during the pandemic, again, this became quite clear. Communities and parents can be involved in sending children well-equipped to learn with adequate nutrition, with prepared mentally for schooling, with support at home for homework, for their studies, and for work. Communities can participate in helping to manage schools, different aspects of schooling. And the ideal relationship would be one in which the parents and the community and the school teachers work together to support the learning goals. It's important, one of the tasks of school is to socialize children and into increasingly, I would argue, increasingly larger units of membership. And so we'll come back to this later. I see that my time is running short, but in this integration or socialization of children beyond the family into the school community, the local community, the national community, and ideally the global community is an important function. And so making sure that the integration is positive, that it doesn't force children to decide between the school or their national citizenship, their local citizenship, or their some other form of membership, but to see these memberships as additive is an important function of schooling with the right relationship with community. Teachers are, and I will stop in a minute, teachers are come generally from the community. And again, their relationship with parents is extremely important for the school to get its work right, and the right relationship with parents and children. So I think I will stop there. Much more to say, but let my colleague join in.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for those initial definitions. I think it's important to underline some of what you've said in terms of the importance of community participation and the role that teachers actually have in going beyond the usual function of qualification and academic skills that schooling has, but more into the socialization, into the formation of identities, instilling a sense of belonging to the community and belonging wider in the world, and a sense of responsibility. I think that is something that cannot happen without engagement in education. So thank you for those first reflections, James. And let me just continue with Dr. Oyasu. Kichi, maybe if you could tell us how community-based learning is contributing to transform education and to advance more sustainable, peaceful, and inclusive societies. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I prepared a slide, and since I used to work in the community development through non-formal education, and now I'm involved in the school to promote ESD in Japan. So let me look at the both sides, and the first slide share from the school education side. And community-based learning can provide learners with opportunities to learn with local context and local issues. Particularly when introduced inquiry-based learning, that is popular in many contexts, and we need to have good and also relevant content for learning, because if the topics are relevant to our own life, and it's easier and also effective to come up with good questions and to raise and also discuss and further explore. And the second point is community-based learning also provide good opportunities for learning by doing in collaboration with local stakeholders. And well, such kind of learning is not very easy to do in a classroom or in a school. So this kind of relationship is collaboration is important. And this leads to my third point, the collaboration with the community people, NGOs and local government can widen the views and the understanding of the students. And these three competencies, knowledge and socio-emotional and behavior, these are emphasized a lot on the ESD and the GCED, and that should go with the relevant content for developing the metacognitive skills. So interaction with local people is very important. The pictures showing is the example from Kesenuma City, the northeastern part of Japan. The place was hit by big earthquake 10 years ago, and tsunami 10 years ago. And so students can learn in the community with the community stakeholders about biodiversity and fishery as an industry, and also local culture. They also learn the disaster risk reduction that can also lead the environmental issues. I'd like to stress the point that we cannot expect or we cannot ask teachers to meet everything. I mean, this complex society, teachers do not one single teacher do not know everything. I mean, we need to have some kind of collaboration with the local people. So in this Casanova city, there are coordinators support the inquiry learning. And these coordinators are not school education background, but they have experiences of active learning and interactive learning. So this way, teachers also can learn from the community and the people outside of the school with good expertise. So that's how we can, this whole community can contribute transformation and also inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Yasu. I think there's a couple of things that have been said that deserve recollecting, and I think we have the time to build upon them. One of them is that this active pedagogy, this learning by doing, is something that is very important, particularly for the topics that we are addressing in this forum. It's difficult to learn about biodiversity without being exposed to it. It is difficult to learn to participate without participating in the community. So one lesson I think is that going beyond the school walls and reaching out to the community is something that is necessary for this transformative education to happen. But there are challenges to that. So maybe let me get back to James to see maybe if you could mention what are some of the main challenges for community participation in education, and how teachers, principals, other education personnel may contribute to strengthen it. So James, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Very interesting questions and topics. Community-based learning is really important, an important source of learning, as has been noted, and it's difficult, also been noted. And so one of the challenges is helping teachers and schools, helping them get out of the school into the community, to engage the community. It takes time, it takes a fair bit, it takes getting out of a comfort zone of the familiar role of the teacher in the classroom. And so it's an important skill, but not one that is immediately or necessarily something teachers have. So working with them, of course, to learn how to do this, giving them permission in some way to move beyond the classroom is an important thing that schools can work on, trying to help give teachers the idea that it is okay to leave the school building, and that is not necessarily a given. So there's the challenge of it, the difficulty of it. Not impossible, but challenging. There's the problem of less advantaged schools. This kind of community-based work is easier or more often done in communities and schools that have sufficient resources. A lot of schools don't. And so working, devising ways to help communities, help schools in less advantaged areas is important, and perhaps linking schools in different groups. The exam system is a third challenge to this kind of work. Community-based learning, student-centered learning, inquiry-based learning, all of these are important for a deep learning to take place, but they are, if the school system is driven by examinations, these become much more difficult and in a sense often fall by the wayside. I would add that communities are, community participation, at least from the central level, can be take one of two forms. Very simply put, on the one hand, it can be the opportunity for schools and communities to work more closely together, and that's what we think of. But it can also be, in some cases, the abandonment of schools by national authorities. And so school community participation, decentralization can be a kind of abandonment of the government's responsibilities. And so the proper relationship between government, school, community, and parents is really quite important. In this connection, school leadership is important in mediating the relationships between government, school, community, fostering the community-based learning that our speaker has talked about is so important. So let me stop there and come back with questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. I think that you touched upon something that's very important, and it is the actual resources that a school has, and the actual possibility. I mean, even in the pandemic, we saw to leave the school ground and to go into the community. I think that is something that's important. Maybe that is something where technologies can come in those places where the connectivity allows for, as we said before, for exposure, for engagement in places outside the school. But we'll come back to that, and also to the issue that you have raised around assessment. I think it is very important to really wonder what is it that we evaluate. I mean, do we evaluate what we teach, and we end up teaching for what we evaluate? And that is usually the case of this kind of pedagogies. Also, this kind of content that has to do more with the social dimension, with the relational, that is not easily captured in assessment, and it can be disencouraged, and it could disincentivize the engagement and the outreach that the schools and that teachers can actually promote within the community. But we'll come back to that. Let me now turn to Dr. Yasu again, maybe to talk about also what are some of the main challenges that are faced by community-based learning centers, those learning centers that are basically there to engage with the community, to respond to the community, and to support school continuity. Dr. Yasu, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Yeah, for this question, I prepared the second slide about the challenges. And broadly, let me begin with the broad context. And one of the big challenges in not only the school or learning centers, but in the society in general, that the learning has become more individualized. We use computers, and we also use smartphones and search the things we don't know, rather than asking the senior people or parents or teachers or discuss together. I think this is a bit of challenges, particularly the under COVID pandemic situation, and also the younger generations. In the case of the Japanese learning centers, particularly, young people do not come to this kind of community-based places much. And so how we can motivate the participation and attract and then collaborate in the community, that is a big challenge in broadly. And I think people get together more through the thematic groups, like interest group or non-profit organizations, rather than the traditional geographical communities. So how we can make a good local mechanisms and the linkages of the partnership and network of these stakeholders. I just put the diagram of the Okayama City that has promoted ESD for many years. They organize this kind of network. The local government is a secretariat, and different stakeholders, including schools, universities, and non-profit organization, even medias, and they participate. And it started from 48, and now it's more than 300 members in the network. So this kind of developing network is important, but in the case of Okayama, the city government undertook as a secretariat, so that relatively easier, that we don't have too much burden for these member institutions to function as a secretariat. So this kind of developing good network is a challenge in many places. And even if we have this kind of network mechanisms, we have a challenge of the balancing the power. It often happens that some people have a very big voice and power, and some people have to just listen to and follow that kind of decision. James mentioned about the different degrees of participation, and also some disadvantaged communities. And so how we can balance this power within the network and also outside of the network, that is partnership. That is, we often talk about the public-private partnership, but there is certainly a power balance we have to deal with. And some of the challenges is when we talk about the capacity building here, I mentioned, we often think about the capacity empowerment of the people in the disadvantaged situation, but we also need a capacity building of the people with the power, how to release the power, how to listen to others, and come up with some good directions to work together. So this is rather challenging issues we have to deal with. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kichi, for those remarks. I think it is very important to highlight something that you have mentioned as well, which is learning is becoming more individualized, not only by the education system governance, but also probably by the formats and the sources that we have been using of late, mainly references made to technology and to other sources. James was talking about evaluation as well as something that constrains possibly that collective and that relational nature of learning. So that is something important that community-based learning can help counterbalance. And also something important that I would like to highlight is I really like that diagram of an ecosystem of institutions and stakeholders, because sometimes we think that schools are isolated and that the responsibility of learning, or that learning only happens at school. So to this point is important probably to bring back a lifelong learning perspective, one which goes beyond schooling and which sees other places like you put there, the university or the enterprise, and one could add the church, the community center, the museum, all of these learning spaces and learning environments where one can build community and one can engage with community. So thank you very much for that, Kichi. Now, going back to the lessons that we learned from the pandemic, we saw, of course, many innovations come through. And by the way, just let me just make a little parenthesis to say that I'm currently connecting from Kigali, from Rwanda, where we are organizing the Policy Dialogue Forum of the International Task Force on Teachers for Education 2030, and my colleagues will be able to share that in the chat, the link, so that we can continue that conversation. This is taking place on Thursday and Friday online and from Kigali. So you will be able to join. And the reason I wanted to share this information with you is because the topic of the forum is on innovation. And that is something that we've seen as responses to the COVID-19. We saw how teachers just deployed their creativity, their talent to sustain learning, to adapt to online formats or to low technology or to delivery packages and so on. So that was one lesson that we learned from the pandemic, has to do with how teachers participated beyond the call of duty, so to speak, to sustain learning. At the same time, we saw that this agency and this autonomy is not usually granted by education systems. So that is one lesson that we learned from the pandemic, but we learned many others around, for example, how the responses, the educational responses during the pandemic were more or less effective depending on whether teachers were consulted as to what is the best way out of the pandemic, or communities or parents. So maybe let me turn back to James, maybe for a couple of lessons learned from the pandemic that you think could be systematized, that could be applied now to the return to physical classes or to the hybrid models that we're seeing, considering both the actions that a school may undertake to strengthen community participation and support, and the support of communities to educators. So I know it's a long question, James, but if you could share your views.
Sure, thank you so much for the question and the interesting comments so far. And I'm hoping we have time to loop back and discuss some of the points we've raised earlier. One, as you were talking, it occurred to me that one way of thinking about community participation in education is strengthening the ecosystem that was mentioned, and strengthening the connections between school and community and the larger systems. Schools are sometimes isolated, and strengthening those connections in the ecosystem is important. And I think that's become very, very clear, the connections that exist or need to exist between different parts of the system. The COVID pandemic has made very clear that it takes the different partners to really bring about effective education. And so the role of community participation, understood broadly, might be building the ecosystem and the connections between the different parts. It's very clear from the pandemic that parents and community place a critical role in education. And depending on the situation, the resources of the school and the system, parents may provide the only educational role during times of isolation, or the primary role. And so one lesson is to strengthen the role that parents can play. We already know that parents play a critical role in helping children learn to read, in learning to apply and make meaning of what they're learning at school, and building on the role of parents as co-teachers, and the ways that teachers can help parents to teach better seems to me one important lesson. And then the critical role of building this ecosystem of support for learning, the different components of that. And then a third lesson might be to pay attention to those who are left out. The inequalities, COVID has highlighted inequalities throughout the world and in all of our systems, and to pay attention to how these things can be carried out. The best off schools and the best off communities will find ways to manage instruction, but in difficult times of crisis. The poor communities, poor schools are much less able to do that. And so developing ways to help the less well-off communities do so is important, I think. And then, if I may, you asked for 2 and I'm giving you 4 or 5, but the heightening our understanding of the ways that teachers can innovate and allowing them, as you mentioned, helping them to imagine, develop, and extend those innovations is really important through networks and through systems that allow for innovation to come from the teachers, perhaps in partnership with communities. So that's my.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. I think that it's an important, and I think we can come back to the issue of inequality. I think it is very important to consider in what ways the work we do in the classroom might be exclusive, might have that effect of excluding different communities. I think we saw that at the beginning of the COVID as well, and probably that's a lesson that we learned. On the one hand, there was this quick transit to ICTs and to the use of online and mobile learning in communities with very low access to the internet, and that from the start marginalized an important number of teachers. So I think looking at not only the means of provision, but also on the content, the issue of the curriculum, for example, and the representation of the different groups in this curriculum that might actually perpetuate stereotypes, social bias against certain groups, is something that needs to be revised if we really are aiming to transform communities. But now let me go back to Dr. Oyasu, maybe to ask you if you could share some recommendations for strengthening the relationship between the formal, the non-formal, and informal education. We've been talking about lifelong learning, as you know, is one of the pillars of Sustainable Development Goal 4. We want to really emphasize that learning happens from the cradle to the grave in a continuum, and also that it has different purposes, as we have recollected. So it is not only about academic achievement, it is not only about employability, it is about learning how to live with others in peaceful and harmonious ways. So maybe to hear back from you, Kichi, as to the relationships and the possibility of linkages between the formal, the non-formal, and the informal piece.
Okay, thank you very much. When I introduced myself, I mentioned that I work both as non-formal education. I mainly used to work with non-formal education side, and now work with school side as well. To break the wall, as you mentioned, first step is to know each other. I mean, we sometimes build a wall because we don't know each other. So first step is to share information and experience of the different stakeholders of the school and non-formal education setup or informal education personnel, and also learners and students. And it is very important to develop or provide a safe environment for people to talk to each other. So I think that's sharing space and venue beyond the school or beyond the learning center is important. And second point is to take action together. And in my opinion, starting a totally new project is not very easy. I mean, people think about extra burden and the new, responsibility that we have to take, particularly when it comes to the middle of the work plan we have, and then people hesitate to participate or start new. So my suggestion is to review and reflect the existing activities or programs with the viewpoints of some common mission and vision like ESD or GCED, for sense making of these activities that to good for all the stakeholders in the community. So I'm sharing this photo of the community learning centers in Hiratsuka City near Tokyo. That this activity, you can see the cleaning the coast by one learning center, and there is another learning center in the mountainous area, and they used to have some exchange programs, and students and parents and local teachers and resource persons, they get together and enjoy. But under the UNESCO's project, you can see the bottom diagram that we encourage the reflection. What does this activity meaning to us? And so not only just experiencing, but we try to make sense in each activities, and then look at the our own communities and what's the sustainability means to us. So the activities may be the same, but the way they saw and interpret may be different. So that's how we can collaborate between the formal school and the non-formal school and the informal learning, informal dialogues. And here I want to stress that teachers are also part of the community. They are also a community member. They can be also learners. They teach at school in the classroom, but when they become a member of the community, they can be the learners. So it's a way, as Carlos mentioned, lifelong learning, that the lifelong learner, we don't have to have big titles, but everyone can learn from different opportunities. So lastly, it's important to share, disseminate the experience as a role model. And if it's not good models, but if we make a mistake and we fail to do something, but it can be also role models that how we demonstrate our experiences. So that's also important, so that we can inform from our context to other context. So that's kind of process is also a learning process. I think this is also the combination of formal and non-formal and informal learning. And thanks to the technologies, you can organize from Africa, and we meet people from the States and all over. So this way, we have a lot of opportunities to break the walls we are talking about under this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kichi. Let me go back to one of the points that you made around the teaching and the promotion of education for sustainable development, of education for global citizenship, for participation, for critical thinking. It is something that is not usually in the curriculum. The prescribed curriculum will not usually have, maybe there's a subject area around biology and climate change, but not so much on the formation of this kind of everyday habits and everyday kind of like global awareness of the environment around us, including our society, including our communities, and our participation in them. And often enough, the training and the capacity development for teachers is done in silos. So you will have now a course on sustainable development, now a course on participatory techniques, and they complain that the curriculum is already packed enough to bring any more subject areas. So there's a need for mainstreaming and using what we have in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the time dedicated for learning in the classroom or outside. and to make the best of what we have while we work on mainstreaming this in the curriculum. So I would like to ask you both, maybe your views on what kind of teacher education is needed, is possible to promote participation, and then also to promote education for sustainable development. Let's begin with you, James, please.
Okay, thank you. Subject close to my heart. As education is what was it Henry Levin said some years ago? Educational planning is an exercise in hope, something like that. And education goes between ideals and realities, and making our way to the reality is really important. And so your question of what kind of teacher training is important, is necessary to embed these qualities, critical thinking, creativity, self-efficacy, pro-social attitudes of various kinds. And this group that I'm a member of, a bit of an advertisement here, NISEM, our primary idea is that in a poor classroom, in a poor community, one of the few resources that the teacher will have, for sure, is a textbook. And so in order to improve teaching and learning, textbooks need to be organized so that they support teachers in learning to teach, and support students in learning to learn. And so we're working to try to embed these important social emotional skills into textbooks and then into teacher training, so a bit indirectly. But if the textbooks incorporate this mathematics, science, as well as social studies of various kinds, if the textbooks include this, it's much more likely that they will be taught, and that teachers can be helped to organize their instruction during teacher training, in service, pre-service, in ways that support this kind of learning. And so the basic message would be, let's find ways to embed this in the textbooks and then organize teacher training around those textbooks to support this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James. And one would even think that teachers can take an important part of this process of integrating this content in the textbooks and in the curriculum. I think that is also a central lesson we learned from the pandemic, the possibility and the potential of teachers to participate in curriculum development process and instructional design, in the development of assessment tools, and so on and so forth. Thank you very much, James. Now let me turn to Kichi again with the same question. So how do we mainstream, Kichi, in teacher education? How do teachers help in the mainstreaming of education for sustainable development, for global citizenship, by means of community participation?
Yeah, in the case of the Japanese context, the Ministry of Education has put this ESD is one of the principle of the national curriculum standard recently. So there is a guideline and also the policy, but as you correctly mentioned, that we need to have the capacity building of the teachers, and teacher education, we have to look at the capacity of the school management of the classrooms, and also instruction of the students, and also linkage with the community within a school to collaborate each other, and also work in the with the community. So this part we have to make a good linkages with the local community, but it's not in the curriculum of the many of the teacher education institutions. So we have to look at the curriculum of the teacher education institutions before we organize training of the pre-service and in-service teachers. So that's the gap we have to deal with. But the good news is that there are good initiatives at the school level, and school-based training programs are very popular in Japan. So as I mentioned earlier, that if we can see some good role models, the teachers in the school and outside of the school can also be inspired to learn the good examples. So for example, this coordination of the different subjects using the calendar type of the visual materials to see the linkage between the curriculums, and also when we talk about the whole institution approach, again, it can be visualized by the kind of map so that people can see what kind of areas we are dealing with and what kind of actions are needed. So this kind of hands-on opportunities, training opportunities are needed at the institution level and also the school levels. So this is how we look at the implementation of the national policy and the curriculum guidelines to the school levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kimchi. I'll just remind the audience, we still have a couple of minutes if you want to write your questions in the chat. I don't think we have any for the time being, which allows me to ask a question. I would like to ask you, following from the discussion, I think it is very important to learn from one another. I think we've seen how teacher professional development has moved away from the usual short courses, probably subject-based, and more into more participatory, more collective forms of learning between peers, learning between teachers. Examples of that are, of course, the communities of practice, the communities of exchange, but this learning needs a little, I mean, the knowledge that teachers produce in classroom needs a little exploration, systematization, documentation of these practices so that they can be shared, so that they can be exchanged, and that others might learn from probably effective practices in different geographies. But it is not easy, I would say. I don't think it is this idea of a reflexive practice that is systematically documented, shared, and we lose a lot of the knowledge that teachers have when they retire, for example. We always have, I mean, we have all witnessed when we were students or with our fellow teachers, when a landmark goes, when a landmark teacher retires, a wealth of knowledge is gone with that person. So how can we help in the exchange, in the identification and the exchange and the learning of the different practices, be it at the classroom level, at the pedagogical level, or, for example, in terms of teacher education models or teacher education programs that we can learn from? Can you think of an example or a way in which these exchanges might happen, or that they are actually already happening, and how we can foster this learning between peers by means of professional development? Maybe we can start with whomever would like to start.
Well, please go ahead. I feel like I've gone first unnaturally.
Okay. So Kichi, do you want to begin?
Okay. Yeah, I think important thing is we start with self-reflection. I think this documentation, it's not for the purpose of reporting, and then it's become a kind of extra burden or some kind of additional work. But if we encourage the habit of self-assessment or evaluation, and then sharing what we have with peer, that is a good starting point to start. And also we can organize a kind of action research. It's not easy, but the point is that this kind of inheriting the resources and knowledges should be kind of spontaneous. I mean, it's not something that you are forced to do. We encourage the kind of self-motivated approaches, and then the documentation, and then leave the resources to the next person. This also happens in the Japanese schools, that if we have a rotation system, so one teacher moved to another school, and then this memory has gone. So I think that's we can start the encouragement of the self assessment, and then recording, and yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kinchi. Yes, James, please.
So I would say, and remind me of time so that I don't go over, but
we have still a couple of minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, yes.
Okay, then I'll try to be brief. I think permission. Part of it is the idea that this is an important thing to do, and permission to do it, to share ideas, to go beyond. So both the idea that it is a possible and a good thing to do is one step. If it can be presented as opportunities rather than burdens, that's helpful. So teachers are working to improve their practice. If collaboration, documentation, in a sense, networks can help them in their work, then it becomes less of a burden and more of an opportunity. And so finding ways to make this kind of sharing an opportunity to improve practice, and also to, in a sense, lighten their burden, because they can get good ideas from others. And then external resources, external agents to help document the work and share with others. So I would say networks, permission, opportunities rather than burdens, and external government or international organizations, others working to help carry the work of actually documenting and disseminating ideas, the action research that you mentioned earlier. So those are the things that I would say.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you very much, Kichi. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I would like to first of all to thank you for these points, which I think help us move in the direction of seeing teachers as key actors and key players in the development of these forms of learning that are more communal, that are more participatory, and that rely more also on the community. So I just to wrap up, I would like to recollect some of the points that were made during this session, and I think it boils down to the role of the community and of the teacher as part of that community. It is important to say that teachers are no longer only curriculum implementers, but they are actually community leaders. They are role models, as Kichi said. There are moral authorities. They have an authoritative voice, and we aspire to have that voice of teachers heard, the knowledge that they produce captured and recollected. So I think that is one of the issues that we would like to highlight. And I see that James also says that all meaningful innovation is carried out by teachers. So I think that is also a lesson that we have learned during the pandemic. As we've said before, it was the innovation of teachers that actually was that allowed for the continuation of learning during school closures and educational disruptions. But conversely, this innovation is not always fostered. It is not always promoted. The creativity that they have, the room for decision making that they have, is something that they are not usually granted. So teachers are indeed innovators, but they need the stimulus, they need the space within which to innovate. So if we really want to see teachers as these authoritative voices, as these role models, as these community builders, we have to grant them more autonomy. We have to grant them more agency. And that is, I think, the role of the education leaders, of the school, but of education systems altogether. And something important to consider is also the working conditions of teachers. That has to do not only with remuneration, which is important. As you may remember, one of the indicators for the Sustainable Development Target 4.C, which is the commitment to improve and to augment the number of qualified teachers, has to do with their working conditions. That their working conditions are at a par, not only with their responsibilities, but they are at a par as well with other professionals, which is usually not the case in many places. So I think this idea also of the social standing of teachers, of the tools that they are provided with, of the space for decision making, a seat in the table to discuss and to decide the most important things in education, whether it is the curriculum, whether it is assessment, whether it is their own working conditions, is something that is very important. Without that central role of the teacher, it is very little that we can do. And that has to do with engaging with the community, that proximity, that closeness to the realities put them in a privileged position to actually inform the changes that we want to affect in education systems, for them to be more inclusive, to be more egalitarian, for the content to be more relevant to the lives of people in terms of citizenship, participation, social justice and social change, environmental justice, climate change, health, and the different topics that have been touched upon in this and that will continue to be touched upon in this forum. So with that, I would like to thank again our speaker, Mr. James Williams and Mr. Kichi Oyasu, for their participation, and to you all also for participating in this forum. We look forward to the next sessions, and we look forward to further conversations. Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Goodbye.
Thank you.